welcome to Round Robin. I'm your host, Robin McCormick with the City of Hampton. And today we are going to spotlight the work that Hampton is doing on resilience. And if you don't know what that means, it can mean responding to any challenge. But here on the coast with all the rivers, we tend to think of that as sea level rise and flooding issues that we face as a city. So my guest is our resilience officer, Carolyn Heaps-Pecaro. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
That was a big mouthful that I said, and it was probably too much, but explain resilience, because I think people don't necessarily, flooding is the top interest.
Yeah.
What is resilience?
So resilience, as defined broadly, as you alluded to, is really thinking about recovering and enabling recovery from extreme events while also continuing to thrive in the face of chronic stressors. So when we think about it in the context of flooding or being a coastal city, those extreme events are hurricanes, for example, and the chronic stressors are sea level rise and recurrent flooding.
And I think sometimes people want us to stop the water. We can't stop the water.
Right.
And Hampton has taken what I think is a very innovative approach. Do you want to explain that whole Dutch dialogues, kind of how we look at it in a multi-pronged way?
Yeah, so Council's strategic priority area, Living with Water, is really the driving force behind the city's approach to resilience. And living with water means exactly what you've said, not trying to engineer the water away, because it's really, as flooding becomes more common, more frequent with climate change, it's really going to become even more impossible to do that in the long term. And so living with water means finding ways to embrace it as an asset and allow it to exist naturally in the landscape where it wants to be naturally, with our natural watersheds, with our rivers, creeks, etc. And so our approach is really holistic in thinking not just about the physical environment, but also all of the social and economic benefits that come from being a coastal city with this wonderful asset of our waterways here to benefit us.
So it may mean we can't stop the river from flooding, but we can have places near it that hold that water.
Sure.
And
Yep.
or, homes that are elevated or different building standards so that the flooding might still happen, but we can recover better. It doesn't damage property or threaten lives as much as it can now.
Exactly, and some of what we learned from the Dutch in those Dutch dialogues that you referenced were making room for the river and creating that space for natural floodplains to exist, whether that's by ensuring that we don't want to build houses in the floodplain. First of all, that's not a smart practice. But
that ship sailed.
Yeah, in some cases that ship has sailed. But where we can, to think about adapting our landscape so that, as you've said, those areas that are in the floodplain are places that can be floodable without creating damage, but are still usable spaces. So whether it's a park space that can flood and become, when it's dry, a soccer field, for example, or whether it's a pathway next to water that's not going to be damaged from flooding, but is still something that can be used during dry periods.
This is really different than a lot of cities in terms of approach. Would you like to tell us about how Hampton was recently recognized by the state for the things that we're doing?
Absolutely. So Hampton recently received an award from the American Planning Association's Virginia chapter, recognizing our efforts by being named the Resilient Virginia Community of the Year, which is a very exciting award from the planning profession, recognizing our efforts in really thinking differently about this topic than, as you've said, a lot of other communities. And I think one of the things that we were most recognized for is that we create plans, because this is a planning award, that are highly implementable. And I think we've been really intentional in doing that by engaging a lot of different disciplines in the planning process, but also engaging the community really heavily in the planning process. And so we've tried really hard to get people's opinions, not just on what the project ideas are, but from the beginning of where do you think projects are needed, where do you experience flooding, but also what are the assets that you want to protect into the future. So those were some of the elements we were recognized for, and some of the kind of principles that we keep in mind during the planning process that I think are, best practices, but not always accomplished through planning.
And I also remember the award, which I hope I've mentioned before on the show, but certainly we put out a news release about it. Hampton was the first, at least Virginia locality, to adopt environmental impact bonds.
Correct.
And that was something that council endorsed. Explain to me what that is.
Yes, so an environmental impact bond is a municipal bond. So it's a loan that the government is receiving from the private sector, and typically our bonds are financing large capital projects. This is just the same. So it's a money that we're borrowing, but the way that it's different is that this particular bond is tied to specific outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And we received that EIB environmental impact bond financing for 3 of our pilot projects for resiliency: Big Bethel Blueway, Lake Hampton, and North Armistead Avenue road raising and green infrastructure. And for each of those 3 projects, we set very specific goals for water storage that we agreed to accomplish in order to be considered for this type of bond. And so environmental impact bonds are appealing to investors that are looking to invest in, not just outcomes for profit, but also outcomes for the planet. And we've tapped into that bond market by being the first locality, as you said, in Virginia to issue an environmental impact bond, which we're very proud of and grateful for Council for the support to do that.
So those 2 things are part of why Hampton is later. But I do also want to throw in, as you and the team have developed these plans, they're designed to also be able to be replicated elsewhere.
Yes.
We are leading the way for other communities and showing, testing, demonstrating, and then showing what works and how it works and how it can help in other places.
Absolutely. And one of our goals is to lead the way. We have a framework for resiliency, and it sets out 8 goals. One of them is lead the way. And that's a key part of that, is creating replicable projects, not just for other communities to learn from, but also for ourselves. So for the Big Bethel Blueway, for example, this is a project in a drainage ditch that we're doing a ditch retrofit, essentially, and creating this amazing trail and creating new wetland plantings, et cetera. And this is really exciting because it is so highly replicable. We could do this in other drainage ditches, and we have so many of them around the community that if this works well, we'd like to replicate that elsewhere.
So give us just a little more detail about that, where it is and what you're going to do around that.
Yeah, so
stream. We'll call it a stream.
Yes, not a ditch, a stream. So this is a drainage canal that takes stormwater runoff from the areas just west of Big Bethel Road, between Albany Drive down to Joins Road.
And for people who don't know, it's the south of Mercury Boulevard, not the Big Bethel heading up toward York County. Not where Bethel High School is.
It's actually, the project just crosses over Mercury Boulevard.
Oh, okay.
So it's very slightly north, but you're right, it's basically all south of Mercury. And so the project will take this existing drainage structure and do some excavation, some layback to increase the amount of storage we can accomplish, so water storage in that channel itself. And we'll also be adding some water management infrastructure called weirs throughout the body of that to hold back water. And the whole purpose of this project is to slow and store, in our initiative's words, water in the landscape, because one of the big challenges we have in this area is that stormwater runs off too quickly, and it ends up flooding some of our downstream neighbors where it reaches Newmarket Creek, where it drains into the creek. And so by holding back some of that water, our goal is to reduce that downstream flooding while not creating any additional flooding for upstream people as well. And so beyond that, the project will also have a multi-use trail, which we're really excited about. It'll become a linear park space.
And that means multi-use trail means walking, riding, biking.
Exactly.
Okay.
Any non-motorized vehicles. And we will also have some boardwalks to get out a little bit over the canal itself, and educational signage. So it'll be kind of an integrated space to appreciate the system and also effectively improve, hopefully, some of that flooding that's currently experienced.
All right. So that's Big Bethel Blueway. And what else do we have that's down, further into the planning,
Sure.
almost implementation stage?
So the other 2 projects that I mentioned were Lake Hampton and North Armistead, and those 2 projects are connected to each other. And for those viewers who are familiar with Home Depot,
I was going to say,
right next
most
to
people
that,
don't know Lake Hampton, but they know
Yes.
the area, the Home Depot area
Exactly.
where it floods across the
street.
so much of the time.
Yeah, so we, as you've just said, North Armistead floods there pretty often, especially when we get these big tidal events coupled with stormwater. And so what we're doing with this project is trying to minimize that roadway flooding, both through raising North Armistead itself and then also through cutting off that tidal influence on the lake. So right now what happens is the creek backs up into the lake overflows and floods into the street. And so we're going to cut off that backflow, hopefully, and then keep more water stored in the lake to reduce that flooding from happening, in addition to raising the road. There again, we're really excited about the opportunity to enhance this kind of existing park space. So for those viewers who might be familiar with this area, we already have the water walk trail,
Right.
this location. What we'll be doing is extending kind of a spur trail that'll go around Lake Hampton in its totality, and offer an opportunity for people to get out and see different sides of the lake. There's some interesting bird species there. We'll be creating actually a bird island in the center.
Oh, that'll
Yeah.
be neat.
So right now it's a peninsula, but we'll be cutting that off, and the intent of doing so is to create somewhat of a bird sanctuary where they can really nest and thrive in that space. So again, it's kind of an integrated project, and that's a lot of what Resilient Hampton tries to do, is create these assets that are usable for the community and not just functional for water storage, but really accomplish both benefits.
That is exciting. So how do we go about figuring out which area we're going to work on or which project? I know you've done neighborhood studies in different places in the city.
Absolutely. So all of the 3 projects that I just mentioned came out of our New Market Creek Watershed Plan, which was our first watershed level study in the city. And through that process, we worked with the community and with experts, with our consultants, to identify what projects would make the most impact, and where we could create these connectivity benefits as well, these other assets. We're currently working through a similar planning process for downtown Phoebus and Buckrow. So we're about halfway through that planning process.
Okay, so that's,
now.
they're grouped together, that's one study.
Yes,
Okay.
downtown Phoebus and Buckrow, those watersheds are being combined into one study
Because
area.
a lot of it is that
The Hampton
River right there.
Exactly. And so that we expect to have a final plan sometime early next year. As a result of that, we are currently involving the public and want everybody to be involved. So
Yes,
if you
yes,
haven't
asking
engaged,
for
please
input.
do. And that process will similarly identify projects that we can then implement in those areas. This can't all be done at once. All the projects can't be
They're very
implemented at once.
expensive.
Yes, and time consuming. So we do still have a lot of projects. There were 20 projects identified in the New Market Creek Water Plan that we're continuing to work toward implementing.
So New Market Creek, I don't know that people understand this. They may know a part of New Market Creek and think that's it, but it runs through almost the whole city. Like between the creek and its drainage ditches and offshoots. How? I mean,
It's a big watershed.
yeah, it's the whole center of the city.
It is, absolutely. And one of the concepts that came out of that plan was connecting that watershed through a loop trail. So the idea was to create those integrated features to both think about water management throughout the whole watershed through these projects, but also to connect the area through alternative walking, biking opportunities, and our park spaces, because we have a lot of park spaces that currently loop around following the river. But yes, it's a big watershed. It also, part of it's in Newport News, so it's not even all in Hampton.
The government ditch is my favorite thing in the world. I'm like, what is a government ditch? No one has
Yeah.
ever heard of that
nice
until
name.
you start to get involved in this.
Absolutely.
And you realize that, when you look at the early maps of Hampton, you see that it has always had waterways. And, 400 years ago, as we began to settle this city, people didn't know, and places were filled in, and ditches were built with 90-degree curves and
Yes.
other things that, isn't natural to water. So we're really, you're going back and saying, we are what we are, this has been done. How can we now find the best ways to live with this?
Absolutely. And thinking about the future, thinking about what climate change will look like for our city, what sea level rise will look like for our city, what more stormwater will look like, and how we need to think about adapting. That's really what we think about constantly, is, looking out 50 years, a century. The landscape is going to change fairly dramatically in some ways. How do we be proactive in thinking about the future, maybe in ways that in the past we weren't so proactive in thinking about where water moves through the landscape.
And you've got a lot of partners. I mean, I think that is a huge thing too. This is very science and research based. And
Yes.
while we might not exactly know what's going to happen in 50 years, there's a lot of predictive models about where we need to focus.
We're very lucky to have a lot of resources, both locally and regionally, focused on this issue. Of course, our neighbors, Norfolk and Virginia Beach, are also thinking about this and doing a lot of their own work. I think we do a great job partnering with other localities, but then, of course, with NASA Langley Research Center right here, they do a lot of this work, and a lot of the regional efforts going on to connect them throughout the Hampton Roads to science is robust, and we're proud and glad to have that support.
Absolutely. Now, this is a particular interest of mine, and I could talk all day, but I think probably that would be overkill for our viewers. But for people who want to learn more, tell us the website and whatever, if there are other opportunities.
Yes, so the website is just www.hampton.gov/resilient. That's our website. You can find information there about our plans, our ongoing projects, contact us, and to sign up for our newsletter. There's a link there.
And the newsletter keeps people in touch and lets them know when something new comes up or when there's an input opportunity.
Yes, we send it once a month, and we try to include only the most interesting and relevant, a few stories about how you can get engaged. I would recommend anybody who's interested to check out the main branch. If you're watching sometime close to when this is filmed,
I was going to say
the main branch or Phoebus libraries. We at both of those locations, we have display boards showing information and opportunities for feedback there. And then lastly, I would say get involved with the community plan, because that is a huge opportunity to think about our future, and this is a really integral part of that.
All right, and I will also throw in that is hampton.gov/Hampton2040, because we're looking into the future at what Hampton's going to look like, which is, of course, what you're doing on the resilient side. So
exactly.
Perfect tie-in. Well, thank you so much for coming by today. I appreciate it.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. And I hope you have learned a little bit. You may be very up to date on what Hampton is doing, but for those who aren't, the water is a critical area that's going to affect our future. And by our future, I mean, a couple of months from now, potentially. So please do think about getting involved or keeping up with what the city is doing, because there's a lot going on, and we are a model community. Thanks for watching.